grant scores?
I have done one resubmission.
Okay. And how about, I guess Jeannie is your name? Have you ever had to do a resubmission or gotten as far as getting on the computer to get your grant scores? Because I can talk about that if you'd like. Okay, I guess I'm not hearing Jeannie. I saw that you took off your microscope mute, but I'm still not hearing you. So I will just keep moving on. So, hello? I think I hear somebody briefly. No, still can't hear you. So, so the thing that I want to basically just put it on for the record, especially since this is being recorded, that you almost always, when your grant is assigned to a study section, will get a date for the review meeting. And in most cases, within 2 days and no longer than a week after that review meeting, your preliminary scores will be posted to the NIH Commons website. And that usually those scores are posted quite a long time before you'll get an email saying you should look at your scores. So usually, I usually start looking for my scores within about 2 days after the end of the review meeting, and just keep logging in as we go. So, you know, it sounds like that people have been through some of this process, but I'm just sort of going to start at the beginning. So essentially, so let's say 2 days after the review meeting, you log onto the website and you get to the location where you'll see your score. Now, the score that is listed there, you should have, under most circumstances, 2 numbers. One will be an impact factor, and the other one will be a percentile. So NIH scores grants on an impact factor scale, and the scores that you will see as an investigator, you will see scores ranging from 10 to 90. 10 is a perfect score, while 90 is the worst possible score, which is a grant with no virtues at all. That basically almost never happens. And the reason is that most study sections don't discuss grants that are in the bottom half of grants that have been submitted based on their preliminary scores. And if your grant is in the bottom half, instead of a number in that location, you will see either the words not discussed or you'll see a plus in that location where it should normally stay scored. So essentially, if you see a number at all, it means your grant was in the top 40 to 60% of grants reviewed, and that's always a good thing. It can sometimes really matter to people above you whether or not your grant was scored or what's called triaged or streamlined, or there's different nomenclatures for it, but the not discussed category. Sometimes your grant might not have actually been in the bottom half, but there could have been a large score discrepancy where maybe one person voted a 2 and one person voted a 7. But the person, when they looked at all of the reviews, they realized they could never argue the grant down to a fundable score. So they just leave the grant on the not discussed list, even though the reason it was on the not discussed list is because of the score discrepancy. But basically, that you're going to get it. So what that really means is that it's very seldom to see a posted score on a grant that's worse than about a 60. Most grants that get scored are usually in the range of 10 to 50. So is that clear to everybody? Just since I can't tell what anybody's doing, please jump in if you have any questions. All right. So something else that you need to be clear on is how is that impact score calculated? That when your grant is assigned to a study section, it's almost always going to receive 3 independent reviews. Under rare circumstances, there will be 4. If your actual reviewers, each of these reviewers is supposed to have read the grant, written critiques, and assigned their scores to you. Sometimes you'll get reviews that are more, sometimes you will get scores that are more sometimes you'll get critiques that are more complete from some reviewers than others, because reviewers will be assigned either a primary role, a secondary role, or a tertiary role. And if they're assigned a tertiary role, they're only expected to write a short paragraph. They're not expected to necessarily write a full grant critique. And often that if you get 4 reviews, for instance, 2 would be assigned a tertiary role. So, and all of these documents are, she's got them. So, so I was basically, just so you're aware, I started out just kind of talking about how scores are gotten and how do you get your primary grants. So where we are right now is, how did you actually calculate the scores? So each one of these reviewers will be asked to give your grant a impact factor score. An impact factor is really supposed to be their opinion on whether your grant is going to maintain a sustained impact on the field. Impact factors, because of the likelihood of a sustained impact is what you're going for, it is not just driven by the research plan. It's not just driven by significance or investigator or anything else. It's an aggregate opinion of the reviewers. So these initial impact factor scores are on a scale of 1 to 9. They cannot give partials, so they can give a 1 or 2. They cannot give a 1.5. These are preliminary scores are assigned prior to the meeting, and they're uploaded to the website. And what they do is that they take the average of those 3 preliminary scores, and they rank all of the grants in order. And essentially that they'll take the average of those 3 reviews. And then a line will be drawn. So the grants in the top half of those scores will be listed for discussion. The ones in the bottom half will be listed to be not discussed. Now, sometimes grants in higher, grants can be worse at a 50th percentile in that ranking and still be discussed. And that's the most common reason if there's large score discrepancies. Let's say one reviewer gives a grant a 1 and one gives it a 7. Sometimes that can happen, depending on the study section and the area. That can happen very frequently. Now, in these circumstances where there's a discrepancy between the reviewers are then asked to look at each other's reviews. Sometimes the person who got a 1 is in a different area or has a different perspective, and when they read the reviews of the person with the 7, they'll decide, yeah, I probably was too enthusiastic. And under those circumstances, the grant will probably stay undiscussed. However, sometimes, and actually sometimes pretty frequently, if somebody really likes a grant while another reviewer doesn't, and it drops it in the bottom half, any reviewer at the meeting can request that a grant be discussed with no explanation. So, and it's not that it's pointless. I have definitely seen this go both directions. I have seen an enthusiastic reviewer convince a negative reviewer that they misread the application or they weren't looking at it the right way. But I've also seen it go the other way, where a reviewer who is very negative, who has an expertise in certain aspects of the grant, but the positive reviewer was not, convinces the positive reviewer. And it's rare, but it also can happen where the large score discrepancy is maintained all the way through the review meeting. And those are probably the most frustrating in some ways for the applicant, because it's going to be very clear that one person loved your grant and one person thought it was terrible. And you kind of feel like caught. But, you know, that's one reason why there's 3 reviewers. The goal, if possible, is during the discussion to reach something like a consensus. But like I said, there's no obligation for there to be a consensus. So if the reviewers are giving scores of 1 to 9, why do you get scores from 10 to 90? Well, the reason has to do with what happens during the discussion. That basically everybody gets a chance to read all the reviews ahead of time. Then you go into the study section meeting. Remember I mentioned that there were primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers. The primary reviewer is usually the person with the most expertise on the application. They are asked to give a synopsis of the grant and a synopsis of its strengths and weaknesses that drove their score. Then the secondary reviewer is given the opportunity to concur or to add additional information or to rebut the primary reviewer's opinion. The tertiary reviewer is given that same opportunity. Then the grant is open for discussion. Sometimes most of the rest of that study section has not read the grant. And that could be between 4 and 20 other people who are on that study section. They have absolutely not read their grant. They're going to make their vote based on the commentary of your reviewers. Now, sometimes the other members of the study section will ask clarifying questions. Sometimes they will say that a reviewer is too enthusiastic or not enthusiastic enough based on their comments. Like a common thing, especially with a new reviewer, is that they might make these very negative comments and then give the grant a score of a 2. And more experienced reviewers will say, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Your comments are disparate from your score. But there's this long discussion. Now, then the question is called and everybody votes on their computers. That your votes of the people who have not reviewed the grant, you're usually constrained between the scores of the reviewers. So the people who reviewed the grant maybe gave it a 2 to a 4. So the people on the study section have to give it between a 2 or a 4. And it's basically their conscience based on what they think the grant sounds like based on the discussion. Basically, that it is possible to vote outside of that range. That can happen when the reviewers seem very biased in the sense that the grant has a lot of problems that the reviewers are not piling into their score. I have definitely seen half of the study section vote outside the range because the reviewers' comments and their scores didn't coincide. Unfortunately, this part of the process, it's almost always a worse score, not a better score, because of human nature. But if somebody really feels strongly that the scores are not indicative of the grant, they can be asked to write they must say publicly why they're voting outside of the range. In some cases, they're asked to also provide a written reason that they're justifying scoring outside of the range of the scheduled reviewers. Once all of that is done, the scores of all those panel members are tallied by computer. They're averaged. And then the average is multiplied by 10 to generate that final priority score you see. So if you get a score of 20, it probably means all of your reviewers gave your grant a 2, the range was 2, everybody on the study section voted 2. However, if you get a score, let's say of 15, that is basically an even split between people giving you a 1 and a 2, and it gets averaged to the 15. So if you get something other than a factor of 10 in your score, you know there was some discrepancy among the study section members of what the assigned impact score was. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So the other important number in this process is if your grant was scored, it also receives another number, and that is the percentile. Now, this reflects how good your score was compared to all of the applications reviewed by that study section over the past year. It's averaged over 3 funding cycles. So it's not just how your score did in that particular meeting. It's the other 2 prior meetings of that same study section. And this is important because that sometimes the study section doesn't give any good scores. And other times the study section may give a lot of good scores. So this is supposed to even out the average quality of application cycle to cycle. Now, this is only true if your grant is being reviewed by a standing study section. It can also be reviewed by a special emphasis panel. In other words, not a regularly constituted study section. This happens if, let's say, one of your major mentors or one of your major collaborators is a member of the standing study section. Your grant will go to a special emphasis panel. Now, special emphasis panels are usually pretty small. They're usually only about 6 members. They may only be doing 6 to 10 grants. So there's not enough data in that, and they also often, the grants tend to be very biased towards people who are members of study sections. So there's no uniformity in the quality of those grants, and there's not enough grants to percentile. So how they do percentiles is that they take a look at all the special emphasis panels from a large swath of the NIH. And sometimes that can be helpful to you, sometimes that can hurt you. And the reason is that the important score is the percentile. And how that percentile is calculated, different study sections, different grants, different scores fall in different places along the percentile range. Like the study section that I've been on pretty much never gives the score of 1. Other study sections may give 5 grants in every cycle, scores between, a number of grants are going to get scores of 1, which means that the percentile of a 17 can be drastically different between study sections. And that can drastically affect whether you're funded or not. So 2 grants with the score of 17, in one case, that might be a 3rd percentile and be absolutely funded no matter what. And in another study section, it could be a 16th percentile, which is outside of the funding line. So it really comes down to the percentile as the important score. The purpose of it is to normalize study sections scores relative to each other, because each study section has its own culture and what its score means. But there are times when that is problematic, let us say. Any questions about percentiles and scores? Okay.
A question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How are the scores compared to the pay lines? For example, I received a score this week, but I was told that the pay line for the next fiscal year will be applicable to this grant.
Okay, so you got a score in June, right? Okay, so the reason it's the pay line for the next fiscal year is because once you get your score, then there is going to be what's called the Board of Scientific Counselors meeting, which is basically the grants that are recommended for. So actually, I can kind of work that in here. I forgot to mention that here. So your question really points to the percentile is a major part of the information that an institute uses to decide on funding. All institutes have these pay lines, which are the percentile cutoffs where they'll fund a grant, and that's what I think you're referring to.
Right.
Now, some institutes make these very public, like the one who does bone research. These are very public, while these are not public at the National Eye Institute, and they can only be inferred. You can kind of get an idea of what the pay line is, but you're never completely sure because the National Eye Institute does not make that public. Now, from the standpoint of what the pay line means, that some institutes, if they're publishing their pay line, will fund everything below that because they've committed to. However, I think one of the reasons that my institute does not, and I understand there's a situation going on right now where all of the top ranked grants that came through the February study section meetings were all in the same area of research. And this is an area that they don't necessarily want to put all of their funding into, because there's other areas they also want to make sure get covered. And they want to have flexibility to be able to fund grants evenly across different research areas. And another reason is that some cases a grant may get a good score, but the institute is not that interested in that area of research, and they are making that a very low priority. Now, from a standpoint of the institutes that do have very public percentiles, that all grants within the pay line or not are subject to a second round of review, and this is called the Board of Scientific Counselors. All of the institutes have them. So what happens is that the study section, the program officer of the institute has a general idea of how much money they have and how many grants they can fund. They will make a list of all those grants, a list of all of those reviews. And then they also look through the grants, looking for grants that they'd love to fund if they had money, or grants that maybe were outside of that pay line, but are the only grants coming in a very important area for the institute. And they're very promising new investigators. Let's say a new investigator just published a first author paper in Science that they really want to see get their grant, but their grant scored a little bit too bad to get within the pay line. So there's the, yes, I'll definitely pay, and then there's the ones that we'd love to pay if we can, or that we want to pay outside of the priority rank. So sometimes a grant might, let's say the cutoff is a 10 percentile. Sometimes a grant might get paid 20th percentile because it's in a very, very important area that's an institutional priority, or it's a young investigator that just published a very high impact paper that they want to be able to bring into their funding portfolio. So the program officer is the person who makes those initial proposals. They then present this to the Board of Scientific Counselors. This is a group of extramural scientists usually that are considered the top people in the field, usually extremely senior full professors who've been doing things for a long time. And essentially the grants that are well within the pay line, they get rubber stamped. The grants that are in this gray area are then sort of ranked at the second level of review by the Board of Scientific Counselors. Then money, basically, that the Institute needs money. Now, the problem that has been plaguing science, especially for grants that are in the cycles that your grant is in, is that basically the Congress has never managed to get the NIH budget or any federal budget put together when it's supposed to be given. The federal fiscal year starts October 1st. They're supposed to have a full federal budget in place by September 30th. There have been years where they haven't ever done a budget for a certain year in the past 10 years. So what this does is it makes it very difficult for the program officers to plan. So when they are telling you that your grant will be taken care of through the next fiscal year's pay lines, is that at this point they have absolutely no idea how much money they're going to have.
Okay.
It's probably not going to be less than they have this year, but it could be more, and that they may unfortunately not know how much money they have really clearly ever in the years where there's not been a federal budget. And in other years that, you know, how there's all these continuing resolutions and possible government closures and all of this, this is because there's no budget. So they're usually working on assuming that they're going to have the same amount of money as they had the prior year. And then they take that number and take 10% away from it. So they'll they'll only fund until that federal budget is passed, if it's ever passed. They really are going to be keeping you, unfortunately, on tenterhooks for a while about whether your grant is funded. I mean, if you got a 10 on your grant and you got a 1.2 percentile, they'll pay it. But let's say if the pay line is a 10% and your grant is somewhere between 8 and 13, they're going to keep you guessing for a while. And it's not that they're trying to be jerks. It's that they honestly don't know how much money they're going to have. And they don't want to make promises they can't keep. So from the standpoint of your grant, that it's probably going to hit council, I'm guessing, October. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
And the grant isn't scheduled to start until December 1st.
Correct.
So hopefully the Congress critters will actually put a budget together before December 1st. There have been years where, I know people who were still, for grants supposed to start December 1st, they were still getting strung along into January, February, because it was just a case where the federal budgets hadn't been passed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that what's going on? Okay. It's one of the many frustrations right now of being beholden to the federal government for funding, unfortunately.
Promising for the budget this year anyways.
I mean, they might do a budget this year because they might just not want it to be an issue since we're going into a presidential election year, and they don't want to have this be a point of discussion. But it's always hard to tell what's going to happen because it depends on whether it's politically better for them to just pass a budget and make it go away, or is it politically better to have some kind of fight with the president? I don't know.
Right.
So, yeah, unfortunately, I can't be more positive than that. Like there's a guy in my department who, even though there were budgets passed, the program officer didn't tell him he's getting his grant for July 1, but the program officer wasn't sure about that until like last week because of all of the uncertainties and moving targets about money and so forth and so on. So and that's even that we have a federal budget this year. All right. So to think about it from the standpoint of, so I talked about pay lines. Okay, so this is the grants in the gray area, which miss that arbitrary pay line. And as I said, some of these could be in high importance to the Institute. There could be directed funding to the area. Congress or even the Institute director will often set aside certain funds because they really feel that a certain area is not being investigated. And if there's directed funding to a particular area, your grant could be funded when it's not within the published pay lines. It also, new investigators, they often will get a boost. Established programs, investigators whose research is perceived essential to the Institute's mission. It certainly helps to have a recent high-impact paper. I know one time that I had a grant that was a little outside the pay line, and suddenly I stopped getting hemming and hawing from the program officer when I sent an email saying I had a high-impact paper published. And it's important to sort of be in contact with your program officer. Update them with a new publication, particularly if it's a high-impact publication, because they need to show that their portfolio of grants is producing science well that can be highlighted. And by saying that, like this paper, which is all the preliminary data for the grant, just got published someplace good, they feel more comfortable and more able to advocate for you when they go to the Board of Scientific Counselors. They also want to be able to highlight that paper as related to this funding. There's also that you can be funded outside of it if there's other money can be identified. And this is where IDEA program co-funding is really important. Both Delaware and South Carolina are IDEA states. So there is money set aside to support research in these states that have under a certain cutoff of extramural federal support. And that while this is not a major part of the IDEA program, most of this money goes to things like the CTR, which is why we're sitting here, or EPSCoR, IMBRI, those sorts of programs. The IDEA program, that your institute program officer, if you're on the bubble, can nominate your grant to the IDEA program for co-funding. So this is another reason that it's really important to have a relationship with your program officer, because they're the ones that can nominate your grant for things like IDEA program co-funding. They're the ones who can advocate for your grant when you've had a good publication and so forth. However, the time to be, so you, very often it's good to figure out who this person is and start having a conversation with them even before you ever submit your grant. But the time to call them is not right when you get your grant score. Usually, before you call your program officer, you want to wait until you have your reviews. And that can be between 1 to 6 weeks after you get your score. Basically, the program officers will almost always tell you that they can't tell you anything because they haven't seen your reviews yet either. They basically get access to your reviews at the same time you get them. And so often the program officers are in the room while your grant is being reviewed. They're either there physically or they have video conference in or teleconference in. So they have heard the discussion and they are making their own notes from that discussion. But generally, they don't want to talk to you until the reviews are posted. Now, I'll actually go down here because I didn't met this about program officers. Okay. So I guess I'll go in order. The thing that I want to say about the reviews, and this is very frustrating, and it's different than when it was when I was a new investigator. The most important thing you have to realize about grant reviews, they are not written to you as the applicant. You are not the intended audience. The intended audience is the NIH Institute people in program. They're to explain to that individual what drove your impact score and to give the program officer ammunition to justify their funding decisions. And in fact, NIH grant reviewers are actively discouraged from providing advice to the applicant on how to improve the application in the actual grant review. And that can be very, very frustrating because you see these reviews, you're not their audience, so they're not written in such a way to help you improve your application. So sometimes you can get important information out of those reviews, but since you're not the intended audience, that's where a lot of the frustration applicants have with grant reviews comes from, because you're not getting the information you need. What's being written is the information the program officer needs to explain why the funding decision was made. And that's an important distinction. And that can really make understanding what to do with a grant that isn't going to be funded difficult. Now, this is part of having this relationship with your program officer. Can be very important. They can give you some insight or tell you how close or far you were from getting money. So sometimes, you'll talk to them and they'll be like, yeah, you're fine, you're well within the funding line, or yeah, you're in the gray area, you should plan on resubmitting, or that your grant is in a high priority area. They probably won't tell you point blank if your grant is in a low priority area, but often you can read between the lines if that's the case. It can be really important for them to just know who you are. At least in my field, all of the program officers go to this one major conference, and they are willing to talk to applicants in person. They man a booth actually at the trade show part of the conference, and that basically everybody knows what they look like, and they get buttonholed constantly. They sit at the sessions at the conference. So you do get the opportunity, in my field at least, to talk to these program officers. Unfortunately, how helpful any of this will be depends on the program officer's personality and the culture at the institute. Some program officers have a very big commitment to mentoring, especially junior people. Others are just bureaucrats and they don't care. I've lived under both. It is really nice to have a program officer you feel really wants to help you. But I also have had a bureaucrat as a program officer in the past, and it can be very, very frustrating because they don't really want to talk to you. But you should definitely try to make a relationship with your program officer, have them know you. It's not a bad idea sometimes to run the topic of your grant by a program officer before you even apply, so that they can tell you whether or not this is going to be a high institutional priority or not. They can often give you some advice about how to structure your initial grant. They're also the people that you're going to have they're going to be the people, even if you get a good score, are going to decide how many years of funding you get, whether you get your whole budget or not. And sometimes having a conversation with the program officer can be the difference between being funded or not. And like I said, in my case, there's one paper that we published around the time of the Board of Scientific Counselors meeting is when it was accepted. And I think that did change where my grant was on the recommended list, just based on how things were going. And also the program officers can often help you interpret the reviews because they actually listen to the discussion, and they can maybe point out what are the most important points or the most important things that drove your score. So everybody clear about, relationships with program officers and this sort of thing? So one thing, because reviews are not written to you as an applicant, it is really important to get experienced grant reviewers who are either in your institution or field help you interpret your grant reviews. That is really important. However, it is also important that you do not ever contact a member of the panel that reviewed your grant. At the end of your reviews, there is a list of all the panel members. That it is a big, big no-no to contact any person who's on the review panel about your grant and to ask questions about it. Because it's basically, to be honest, it's painful being a member of a chartered study section. I still remember walking through my major conference in the field, and people would just stop talking when they saw me. And it wasn't that, I didn't have a good relationship with people, but you could just tell they were complaining about their grant scores or something. And they're like, oh, she's a member of the study section, And it puts the study section members in a very, very weird circumstance. Also, you don't know if the person you're contacting, they could have reviewed your grant. And that it's supposed to be a wall there where the applicant never talks directly to the reviewer about their application. Okay. So that, and it's actually, if you're, as a reviewer, if you're contacted by an applicant, you are obligated by federal law to contact the scientific review administrator. And things happen. I'm not exactly sure what, but it's not good, and I wouldn't do it. But you do need to have experienced grant reviewers read between the lines for you to understand what's being said and what's important. So from the standpoint of parts of the review, one of the documents that I gave you is a templated review, as well as I put a bunch of guidelines for reviewers. And some of this is like basically some examples of how to write a good, or what NIH considers a good review. Now, the first thing you have to realize is the criterion scores. Now, there are scoreable criteria, and then there are non-scoreable criteria. So the scoreable criteria include investigator, environment, significance, innovation, and research plan. The non-scoreable criteria are things like human subjects, biohazards, animals. These things can make it, if there's negative comments, they can make it that your grant will be held up or never paid. Like if you don't have good human subjects protections, good animal subjects protections, you don't have a good biohazard plan. But they're not supposed to drive your actual score. Now, each of these gets an independent score. The thing you have to understand is that those criteria scores are only superficially related to the impact score. They are not the criteria scores, the impact score is not an average of the criteria scores. That it is basically some of the criteria scores might not even be strongly considered by a reviewer. Environment is a good one because the vast majority of applications are coming from institutions where the environment is just fine to get the research done. So you're not going to get a bump if you get a 1 in environment. It's really just everybody has an okay environment, so it's not really considered in that in your impact score. Basically, it's the discretion of the reviewer how much of each of these things to put into the way that final impact score. And it can even be different within a single reviewer between grant to grant to grant. Because fundamentally, the impact score is what they feel is the likelihood that this will get done. So if the investigator is a Nobel laureate who has a reputation for doing over decades very, very innovative, interesting work in high impact journals, that basically if the research plan isn't all that well fleshed, the grant still may get a good score because everybody's convinced that this person can really get important science done with their money. In another circumstance, it could be that if you're a young investigator without a track record, it could be that, the investigators, okay, you're a young investigator, fine, so we're not going to dish you that you're not the Nobel laureate. But then that priority score will really be driven perhaps by innovation and research plan, because that you don't have the track record to give the reviewer feel that there's a high likelihood of success. But if you write a really innovative, well-crafted research plan, it's like, well, they really have some good ideas. We should give them money. So that's even, two side-by-side investigators are getting the different criteria are weighted differently. Because in the end, is this science going to have a sustained impact on the field? That's what's important. So looking at the criteria scores, go ahead.
Just to clarify, the comments that you just made, they were about the council review, right?
They were what?
They were about the council meeting? No,
this is actually about not the council meeting. This is actually looking at the criteria scores in your grant reviews.
Okay.
Yeah, in the council meeting, most of the council meeting tends to be kind of a rubber stamp of what the program officer has in mind. Almost all of the time in the council meeting is reserved for the discussion of some key places where there may be points of disagreement. It's not, they don't usually get into the weeds of every application. They're just there as a second level of review for the things that are in the grayest of gray areas.
Okay.
So, but but looking at the criteria scores of your for your 3 reviewers, they can give you some guidance on what needs to be worked on, what irritated the reviewer, etc. Like personally, I am a stickler for environment pages, and for environment pages. Mm-hmm. Even I get very, very irritated, particularly by people who are at well-renowned institutions who write very superficial environment pages. Like, no, then I will give reasonably bad environment criterion scores to investigators that do that. It's probably doesn't really go into my impact score at all, but I will give a 5 for an investigator at Scripps because they didn't actually explain that they had everything to do their work. I say it's likely to be okay, but I don't have any information in the application, and I'll give it a 5. So, in cases like that, you'll see what irritated the reviewer. Or, sometimes, most cases, investigator scores are seldom worse than a 3. When they are, it's usually basically based on productivity. That the reviewer just felt that the applicant has not been productive enough, that they have a high confidence that they're going to be successful. And to be honest, the only way you're going to fix that is publish a lot.
Now, with regards to publication, do they look at publications related to the topic of that particular patent, or just publication?
Both. So definitely that your overall career productivity is important. Related to that particular grant, it basically, having publications in an area is helpful. And it's because it shows that you know the field well enough to actually make an impact upon it. It can be hard to change research areas. Mm-hmm. I did it at one time about 10 years ago, and was thinking about some of the stuff I wrote at that time, which was very naive. I think it was obvious in my first couple applications that were not funded that I didn't really understand the area. I had read the literature, but I didn't necessarily get the right impressions from reading the literature. So by publishing some papers in the field that's saying that, all right, I am able to be productive, it's preliminary data in that area, and so forth. But there's also the issue of overall career productivity, is that maybe you've published 3 papers in that research area recently, but if you have 10 years of your prior career through grad school or postdoc where you published 1 or 2 papers, there's going to be still some concern about you as an investigator, just because you don't have a record of career period appropriate research productivity. So yes, and yes. Mm-hmm. You want to put published in the area, hopefully, and you also want to have been just publishing consistently in your career overall. All right, so the criteria scores can be useful. Now, from the standpoint of the written comments, the only part of the written comments that is generally in a paragraph commentary is the impact statement. So that's that 1 paragraph summary that basically is supposed to give a brief overview of what the grant is on, gives the strengths and weaknesses, basically explaining what drove your impact score. Now, you can get more specific information in the criteria reviews. These are generally supposed to be bullet points. They're not a paragraph. They're going to explain the criteria score, and basically this is a detailed reflection of what's in that impact score. the thing that you have to realize, and those are sometimes addressable comments, sometimes not. The thing that you have to realize is that they may or may not tell you what that biggest issue with the grant is, but simply be written to justify the score. And the important point of this is there's an article that I made that is they are just not that into you. And that article was actually written by an ecologist, and all the examples are in the field of ecology, but it is a human phenomena that you do have to be aware of. And that there's an investigator in my department who basically, after she submitted her grant for 2 rounds, and it was scored both times, but it was scored like 45th percentile both times. And the reviews weren't bad, but we kind of came to the conclusion that the issue wasn't with her research plan. It wasn't with the way she wrote her grant. It was the reviewers just weren't excited about what she was trying to do. In other words, they were just not that into it. And so
that's the significance.
Well, it's not just significance. It's that, they could see how it's important, but there were a lot of other grants that were just cooler, right? It's that you didn't meet the cool factor part, right? So that the scientific question was not compelling or interesting, i.e. it was blah. And sometimes something can be very significant but still be blah. Like, yeah, but I really don't care,
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing is that nobody will write in a grant review, it's just blah. Or that it's just the best you'll see, and actually she got this in one of her reviews, is that, it's a solid proposal, but it's not as compelling as other proposals in the study section. So this is the case of that you always have to keep this in mind, is that there may not be a specific addressable item. It could be that it just came across as blah. And so you have to concentrate on rethinking or reframing the scientific question. And that's going to be way more important than concentrating on concrete comments that are in the bullets. So the bullet may say, oh, you should have requested that, you should have done this control, or yeah, this might not have necessarily been the best way to do that experiment. But what they're really trying to say is, it's boring, not that interested. Now, you basically have a couple options here. Sometimes it's a case where you need to just figure out how to market your work better. And there are a lot of, resources out there that talk about marketing. There's actually a book that's actually called Marketing for Scientists, which I have bought, which I think is really interesting. One of the documents that I put up for this is that do you want the unfunded? It's called the unfunded recipe or the funded menu, and it's basically talking about how, depending on how you frame the same argument, can be the difference between boring and exciting. And the example they're using is a restaurant menu. So if you are, let's say, describing a hamburger on a menu, that you can say that flesh of the abductor muscle, minced and then heated to 230 degrees Celsius over this kind of conducting element. Or you can say, free range raised beef braised with secret spices over a tar flame. Which one are you going to buy? It's the same item. And it really emphasizes this idea of marketing your work and framing your science in the most compelling way possible. The other thing that you can think about here is that, you can really think about, you may have to just completely write it in a way to get it to a different study section, because that this is something that's very true in my field. I'm in a kind of a small area, and people in my field whose grants go to, let's say, a protein structure study section might have a really hard time justifying the significance or importance of their work to this very general audience of reviewers. While if the same grant goes to, let's say, a study section where there's lots of people who understand cataracts or other eye research issues, they could say this is really important for us to understand this biological or this disease. So sometimes just rewriting the grant in a way to get it to a different study section, a different audience, can sometimes help as well. Sometimes you don't have a lot of control over that, but you can do your best you can. All right. So in the end, this is a really important point. Should you resubmit? Now, that you will never get money for your research if you stop submitting grants. Oh, and it's important to not have Wile E. Coyote syndrome. And if you've ever watched Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoons, this is, and you're looking at me funny. I don't know if you've ever seen Wile E. Coyote cartoons. Okay. So these are basically, Wile E. Coyote is a cartoon character who's always trying to eat the Roadrunner. And he comes up with these very complicated, very scientific engineering solutions on how to catch this fast little bird and eat for dinner. But the little bird never gets caught. And it's sometimes for the stupidest reasons, that like just something fails that the coyote didn't think about. And sometimes his ideas are brilliant to catch the Roadrunner, but he only ever tries them once, because once they fail, he moves on to the next idea. So that you have to be careful not to give up on good ideas just because they fail due to a need for further refinement. Okay. And there's an article that's on writing out rejection, which is interesting because it interviews a bunch of people that I know who are in my field. And basically it talks about if you get bad paper reviews or you get bad grant reviews, how do you handle them? There are some people who, if a paper gets bad reviews, they'll put it in a dust jar and never take it out and try to submit it again. I know a guy who would do this with grants. If he got negative grant reviews, he would throw it in a jar and never try to submit the idea ever again. He's no longer in science, not surprisingly. That to be able to basically lift yourself up and go and deal with it and try to get your work funded is really the only way to success. A large proportion of applications get 2% in twice. And but you also need to decide when you should resubmit or when it's not time to bother. Now, there's a difference between also resubmitting or sending in a new application. So that basically, sometimes it's better to rework your ideas drastically and send in a completely new application instead of a resubmission. Usually a good rule of thumb is if the grant was scored and the critiques seem addressable, resubmit. Now, that if a grant, though, is listed as not discussed, that needs more thought. Basically, they've said that your first submission was in the bottom half of grants. Usually you have to be in the top 10% to be funded. So now it doesn't mean you should never resubmit a not discussed grant. I have personally gotten a grant funded on the second submission that was not discussed on the first. It can be done. However, it's statistically unlikely based on the statistics that NIH will perceive. So these lower half, triage, streamlined, whatever you want to call them, grants, they have a relatively low chance of getting funded, often because people are unwilling to rework their ideas sufficiently to get it to the funded list, to really, really take those, which you can figure out from the reviews, to heart, and really just completely rework the application. Sometimes you're just better off completely reworking your ideas and submitting a new application instead of trying to go in and rebut the previous reviews. You can do that, especially now with the new NIH grant rules, where they no longer remove resubmissions via the NIH plagiarism software. Now, if you do decide to submit a revised application, the things that are probably your best bet is, first thing is take the reviews, stick them in a desk drawer, and don't even look at them for 2 weeks. And the reason for that is that you need to calm down. And I actually said here is that they called your baby ugly. I know it's in one of these baby bullet points. Yeah, do not write your rebuttal while angry. They called your baby ugly, but in the end, it probably was ugly. Sometimes the way the reviewers pointed it out might have some small things that were not factually correct, but in the end, that you probably at 3 reviews agree that it wasn't a good grant, and it really means that you did not make your case clearly. The reviewers are doing this, basically, reviewers are paid very little. They're doing it because they actually want to help the field in most cases. They're not after you or trying to get you. And that in the end, all the reviewers are really busy people, and they basically have to carve out the time to do the reviews. So they're not going to spend days or weeks on your application. They're going to spend the time they can carve out of their life. So in the end, your grant has to be as clear as possible. So if a reviewer did not understand your main point, the most likely reason is that you did a poor job presenting the ideas. The least likely reason is that those reviewers are stupid. The reviewers are all very smart people. But so in the end, you have to make your case clearly. You have to develop your ideas, and you have to tell a good story. And telling a good story is the most important part of grant writing. Now, the rebuttal right now only allows you a page. When I first wrote this tips list, we were allowed 3 pages. So since you're only allowed a page, you often have to be selective in what you directly address in your intro to the revised application in relationship to what you're able to say. Okay, so so you have to prioritize what seems to be the most important bits. It doesn't mean you don't change as much as you can, but you definitely want to address the most important themes of the reviews in the intro to the revised application. Now, this writing the rebuttal while angrily, I really saw somebody do this. It was a young investigator on their resubmission that everybody thought the person had a lot of potential, and instead of just being humble, they wrote this extremely nasty rebuttal to the reviews, like basically said the reviewers were stupid, etc. And the grant didn't even go back to the original reviews, but it annoyed everybody. Like, how can you completely not respect the effort put in to review your grant? And, it's like, what, this person's mentors didn't read this grant? I mean, how could anybody send in something like that? And the person did not get the grant. He really managed to make any possible advocate on that study section just completely frustrated and irritated with them. So, so this is really important, and that means the tone of rebuttal should be respectful and professional. And even if there were stupid comments, you still have to figure out a way to say, I'm sorry I didn't make my point clearly enough. What I really meant to say was this. So you have to do the best you can. I mean, I think all of us doing science for a while, you will see some dumb comments. This happened to me with a paper, not with a grant, but I was studying premature ovarian failure, and I said it only affects one sex, and I had a reviewer give a half paragraph saying, how can I possibly say that premature ovarian failure only affects one sex? And it's like, this is to the Journal of Biology of Reproduction. It's the top reproductive biology journal, And I did figure out a way to, as respectfully as possible, say the reviewer's an idiot. but it would not have been productive for me to say the reviewer's an idiot. It just wouldn't have been. And so you have to be careful here. Now, this actually, I'll bring it up here, is that this is where you get comments like that. That's when people sometimes can be, they can feel like it might be necessary to contest the reviews of your grant, okay? Now, it's almost never a good idea that if you do contest the reviews to your grant, that contesting of the reviews goes to the Board of Scientific Counselors. Okay? So that's another thing the Board of Scientific Counselors does, is it takes a look at any places where the primary review is contested by the applicant. I know of a few cases where that has been done. I personally am unaware of any cases where that has resulted in the applicant being funded on that submission. It's fine to talk to the scientific review administrator and say, you have some concerns about the prior review because of these reasons. But it's seldom productive to appeal reviews, because sometimes the comment will be like the person will have gotten 2 grants that they were reading at the same time confused, or things like that. They're, again, the reviewers aren't idiots, but they do make mistakes. But this is a case where, you do respectful professional rebuttals. You don't, so you don't, you just don't go there. Another thing that's really important is that when you resubmit, you get recently dated copies of your letters of collaboration or letters of reagent sharing or so forth, because you don't want to submit prior letters that are 9 months to a year old. If the collaboration is crucial and ongoing, the letter really needs to be redone and redated to a recent date. And this is something that I don't think I can emphasize enough. Applicants really it's always easier to blame somebody else for your grant score. And one favorite place to assign blame is reviewer bias against your ideas, your application. You're not in the old boys club, so forth and so on. I'm not denying that it can exist. In my personal kind of world of doing grant review now for 15 years, I honestly see very little personal reviewer bias that I can identify itself. It's basically, somebody is a friendly colleague, but would you really violate your personal and professional ethics for that? And it might be different in different fields other than mine, but I honestly don't see clear reviewer bias in the sense of that a lot of applicants like to put it. So, really, the reviewers are trying to do the best they can. Their job is to put the grants in an order of funding priority. Unfortunately, there's not enough money to fund all meritorious research right now. And we're all fighting against that. And that's kind of the reality of the situation. So I don't think I have anything else to say. Any other questions from anybody? No, we good? Okay. So I'll let Aaron, we'll close things off, and that good luck on your proposals, and to Deepak, good luck on getting your grant. It sounds like you're close, if nothing else. So good seeing everybody. And, if any questions come up about things, also just feel free to send me an email.